your take on stop and frisk. Do you think stop and frisk is racist?
Well, absolutely, there are racial implications. Anytime you have 685,000 plus people being stopped, and 90% of those people being people of color, particularly black and Latino young people, one has to consider the fact that it is a policy that, although it may have started with good intent, has certainly come down to a racial profiling tactic, and it is something that we certainly have addressed that way.
But you had mentioned that you think it acts to criminalize large segments of the population. You've certainly talked to a number of people who have described the rift or the antagonism that would lead towards police. I'm wondering if perhaps that may be an element of it beyond just the strict crime control numbers.
I think, Andrew, one of the things you have to look at is the issue of whether or not officers feel they will be held accountable for their actions. When you see all of the different things that have happened, from Sean Bell to the Tamon Robinson case, which is going on right now in Brooklyn, where an officer used an NYPD cruiser to run a young man down and to kill him when they were trying to apprehend him. You look at Ramarley Graham. Thankfully, there was an indictment. But at the end of the day, there is sort of this sense that the department and the police union and others come out and they're, defensive at all costs of these officers. They defend these officers, and there's no one that's saying there is going to be strict accountability put in place if officers go into communities and break rules. You have to also put accountability measures in place, some way of making sure that officers know if they are caught on video or any other way disrespecting people, going into communities, treating people as less than humans, that they will pay. And until that happens, and until that sort of blue wall of silence is broken, you are going to continue to see this sort of, again, criminalizing of communities.
Do you think stop and frisk is contributing to that behavior or encouraging that behavior, or do you think that stop and frisk itself is part of that behavior?
I think that any program that people do not understand or recognize that it gives license for officers, good, bad, or indifferent, and particularly bad officers, to go into communities and look at people as suspects before citizens is a bad program. And I think that nothing more than the Ramarley Graham incident in the Bronx shows you that stop and frisk can go wild. That is a case of stop and frisk gone wild, where these officers ran into this young man's house and killed him because they seemed to me that they were pursuing an animal and not a human being.
Tamika, you talked about other options that police have. You mentioned community policing and other programs that you would like to see, obviously, in place of stop and frisk. A lot of people may hear that and think back to, the days before, let's say, Giuliani, or the days before stop and frisk, when crime was a major concern in the city, and that seemed to be more of the approach. What do you say to people who are afraid that eliminating stop and frisk would slide the city back into high crime rates?
Well, Andrew, my son, as I mentioned him before, 13 years old, his father has been dead since he was 2 years old. He was shot and killed. Believe me, I'm one of a strong advocate for getting guns off the street. Every time I hear about a gun or someone being shot, it hurts me in a place that is really deep and personal. This organization, National Action Network, and our president and founder, Reverend Al Sharpton, have worked with the city and continue to work within communities on bringing down crime. So there's no one that is saying that we think that, it is okay for people to just run rampant in communities and terrorize communities. We understand the issue of violence. What we're saying is that at the end of the day, there must be another way aside from profiling people who are not criminals. There are young people who are walking through the streets of this city who are afraid of police officers, and that is not an effective program. There are kids who are using the term that they are stop and frisk virgins, that they have never been stopped and frisked. It is not a badge of honor to have officers throwing you up against the wall, disrespecting you. People are getting hurt, people are getting cut, bruised, and all types of things, and they are not even doing anything wrong.
I've been saying, Tamika, that if the roles here were reversed, if it was predominantly black officers stopping and frisking predominantly white citizens in white neighborhoods, a lot of people in the city who stand for stop and frisk wouldn't stand for it for another second. Why do you think there's a disconnect in this case with the way it is in practice on the streets?
Well, Andrew, I think, that goes down a long road. We may have to talk for the next hour about the issues as it relates to sort of the double standard, because that's what it's called. And I think you see that in these cases where, with violence in general, where there's so many, shootings that happen in communities of color, and you don't necessarily see an outcry from the community and a real opportunity for people to sit down and be serious about dealing with crime. And I believe that is because it is happening to people of color. It is people of color killing people of color, and it's acceptable. If you saw this happening on Park Avenue, where young people of a different race were shooting each other, you would see the whole city stand up and say, we are going to address the issue of violence. We're going to make sure that we find ways to get guns off the street. I mean, first of all, let's talk about the fact that, black people and Hispanic people are not making guns in our communities. There are no manufacturers. There is nothing happening in our community that produces guns. These guns are being bought in from somewhere. So if you want to talk about a double standard, it is just, it's very funny to criminalize communities, throw people up against the wall, search people who are not even doing anything wrong, but allow guns to come in other ways. So if we really want to talk about what the focus should be on, the focus ought to be, as the mayor has said this and has been doing a lot of work on the issue of dealing with guns, but the focus ought to be shutting down the ways that guns are making it into communities of color. So when you want to talk about double standards, believe me, it will take us all day to go through sort of this racist, attitude that what happens to black people and Latino people is okay, but it can't happen in other communities.
That's a terrific point with the guns being brought into the city. You mentioned the black on black crime. My colleague Dominic Carter is fond of saying that there is some responsibility within the black community about bringing that down and teaching kids proper behavior and that sort of thing. Is there a role within the black community and for groups like National Action Network within the black community when it comes to these sorts of issues?
Definitely. There is definitely a responsibility for the community to deal with the issues that we are dealing with, our ills within our community. And I certainly think that when, you see violence happening in communities, it certainly opens the door for stop and frisk programs and other type of tactics that don't necessarily work to be introduced into our community, because we definitely need to deal with violence. We need to deal with it. But there are lots of other issues that are plaguing communities of color that lend itself to this sort of violent behavior. People don't have jobs. People are undereducated. Public housing is destroyed. There are a lot of things that are happening in communities of color that you don't see happen in other places. And so young people are left feeling hopeless. And until we build that hope, until we go into communities and let these young people know that your life is important, that you are not just an animal or an object, that you are a human being, and we intend to address the issues that you may not have anywhere to live, that you may go to a school where you're being undereducated, or where you may not have a job and have no money in your pocket and no food to eat. Until we actually address those things, you are going to continuously see this sort of cannibalism that is happening in the communities, because these people are hungry, but they're hungry for hope, Andrew. They're hungry for hope that we need to work on giving them.
Mm-hmm. Tamika, tell me a little bit about the march on Sunday. Why Father's Day? Why a silent march? Why the route that's being used?
Well, and why Father's Day? First of all, there's no better thing to do on Father's Day than to stand up for our fathers and for our men. And this issue of stop and frisk is predominantly happening to our young men and the fathers in the community. And so we decided that on Father's Day, there was no better place to be than to gather our men together to stand for themselves. Why a silent march? The bottom line is we need to show unity, and unity can sometimes be done in silence. And so we are marching together to say that we're there for one reason, one cause, and that is to end stop and frisk and to put the city on notice that today it is a silent march. Tomorrow we may have to step it up to another degree. And so I am asking all of your viewers to join us on this Father's Day. Stand with us this Sunday. We cannot do the work we do without the community. You can complain from your house. You can be upset with the police, but you must come out and show the city in numbers the support that we have for this issue and to end Stop and Frisk.
Now, that was just part of my interview with Tamika. If you'd like to see the entire thing, all you have to do is head over to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Richard French Live. It'll be at the top of the page, runs about 18, 19 minutes, so there's plenty of additional viewing for you there. But I want to get reaction from our panel tonight on what Tamika was saying in that interview. And joining us on our panel tonight, we have Bill O Reilly. He is a GOP media consultant who has worked on a number of campaigns and is active with a number of campaigns right now. We'll get to those campaigns later in the show. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, and Ed Cox, who is the chairman of the New York State GOP. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us tonight. I'm curious your reaction to Stop and Frisk, but also to that interview. And Mr. Chairman, we'll start with you. Do you support Stop and Frisk? And I'm curious your thoughts about Tamika's interview.
I think everyone supports Stop and Frisk. It's a question to what extent and how you do it. 10 years ago, there was a year in New York City, it was 540,000 Stop and Frisk incidents. Now it's 680,000. But for 10 years at least, and going way back, it's always been there. It's part of how you keep crime down on the streets. It's a question of how you do it and to what extent you do it.
And the racial disparities in terms of who's being stopped and frisked, the fact that 88, 89% are black and Latinos, is that a cause for concern?
Where's the crime?
Bill?
2 points. One is just a political point to put on the table. Stop and Frisk has been around for many years, and I don't think it's any coincidence that this issue has suddenly become so large when Police Commissioner Kelly has become a potential candidate for mayor. One thing, I think that's a driving force behind a lot of the criticism going on. I think the conversation is a healthy one, but I think Chairman Cox identified it right. It depends on the extent of the stop and frisking. It depends how much crime you're willing to allow to occur in a city. Stop and frisk has shown to reduce crime. Chicago doesn't have it. The crime rates are much, much higher. So it depends how it's done and what, I mean, if you wanted to shut down crime almost entirely, you could put a totalitarian state in. It's what level do you allow it to occur?
I'm not sure everybody would agree with the numbers or the link that you're making between stop and frisk and the reduction in crime, but that's a point we'll get to a little bit later on. And Dominic, we've been hearing from you all week on this.